Through my time reading philosophy and psychology, both folk and academic, I've grown dissatisfied with the existing treatment of emotions and emotional systems. Both historical and some contemporary views on emotion are reductive and antithetical to phenomenological insights and intuitions. Emotions have unjustifiably been reduced to basic categories and moralized beyond reason or utility. This is why I would like to propose a new way of looking at emotions from a structuralist, psychoanalytic, and ontologically relational perspective that is both philosophically rich and capable of intuitive visual representation. To do this, before we discuss specific emotions, we have to know what an emotion is. The external manifestation of emotion is called behavior. Emotional behaviors can be classified as voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary emotional behaviors are acted upon by the will. I do not assert that there is actually free will, only that will is an accurate description of a mental phenomenon. The will acts in accordance with emotional information to express the breadth of emotional expressions. When someone is angry, they have an increased disposition towards willing that they punch or shout. When in love, kiss or hug. When in fear, run or hide. These emotional expressions have a social component to them because, as external occurrences, they inherently hold communicative value. Sociality is a functional explanation of voluntary emotional expressions evolutionarily. Voluntary behaviors, while closely associated with emotion, are not actually emotions in identity. As the Zen teaching goes, the finger that points at the moon is not the moon, and likewise, behaviors are only pointers to emotions. Behaviorism as an approach to understanding emotion is unable to account for emotions as entities in themselves, and therefore fails to answer questions of emotional ontology. Functionalism also fails to answer such questions of ontology. When the mind and its emotions are defined in terms of their function, their ontological status is left blank. Mind can be viewed as a functional machine that takes in inputs and spits out outputs. But what is it that does the functioning? The functional brain outputs behaviors. But what are sensory qualia like emotions to be considered, as they are neither strictly inputs nor outputs? Functionalism is a way of sidestepping the fundamental question it purports to answer. Functionalism accounts for the finality and affordances of the mind, but not its degree or modality. Functionalism is unsatisfying because it doesn't answer the question of what. The opposite of voluntary behaviors is involuntary behaviors. These are behaviors associated with emotions that are not caused by willing. Examples include accelerated heartbeat, perspiration, blush, muscle tension, and crying, among others. These behaviors are physiological and occur alongside emotions, but are still not emotions in identity. These behaviors reach closer to being emotions because they have a less contingent link to emotions, but they are far from being essential. Physiological responses occur with some emotions, particularly strong ones, but are not tied necessarily to the emotions they are only associated with. The comparison of voluntary and involuntary behaviors is not a discrete binary, and instead should be considered a gradient. The primary example of this is facial expression, which manifests both by immediate bodily reaction and by mental willing. Facial expressions can be suppressed, but only with so much success when tied to strong emotions. Facial expressions can also be faked, which is another reason behaviors don't link with emotions by necessity. Since behaviors are not the source of an emotion's being, we have to look to the other aspect of emotion, sensation. An emotion can be viewed as a sensation, more specifically, a psychosomatic sensation. An emotion, taken as a whole, has a physical manifestation and a mental manifestation. The physical aspect of emotion is objective, in that it refers to the body as an object, whereas the mental aspect of an emotion is subjective because it refers to the private immateriality of emotion. The subject-object divide makes it difficult to ascertain the identity of emotion because both the physical sensation and the immaterial sensation are closely related. The relationship resides in the brain and mind. Brain states give rise to mental states, including emotions. Only the most radical of idealists would deny mind-brain dependency, given the data contemporary science has provided. But there is a risk here of reducing mental phenomena to physical phenomena. The mind features unique properties from that of physicality that distinguish its being from physical phenomena. Its immateriality and lack of spatial location are distinctions that separate the mind's identity from the brain. There is also not a token-to-token identity in the relationship of emotional states to brain states. Emotions are multiply realizable, meaning that the commonality of mental states do not directly correspond to a commonality in brain states. There are not dedicated emotion circuits in the brain, which is why the sensation of fear can arise from a multiplicity of brain states. Consciousness works in terms of representation. The inputs from the world convert to sense data in the mind, and there is something it is like to experience such representations. Common sense and introspection provide a homuncular cognitive model of consciousness, in which there is a meta-observer of observation, a homunculus or little man inside one's head. For reasons that may be contingent or essential based on your metaphysical worldview, this condition is what separates humans from automata. An automaton, which does not experience representations or have a mind, cannot have an emotion. This is why emotions are not identical to physical states. Without the mental sensation of emotion, there would be no emotion or expression of emotion. This also raises the question of why there is a need for consciousness at all, if there even is one. The homuncular view of the mind, despite its intuitive appeal, is problematic because it requires that the homunculus have a mind of its own. The processes of the mind cannot be explained in this theory without appealing to an infinite regress of mind-like entities. This does not necessarily mean that we should adopt the opposite position of viewing the mind as epiphenomenal. In epiphenomenalism, mental representations are purely redundant to the functioning of the body and brain. Although it is hard to argue against the epiphenomenal position in terms of physicality and causation, it seems to ignore the role of finality in nature. Nature is rarely redundant, and epiphenomenalism is untenable to our understanding of evolution and the way in which adaptive traits serve functional and final ends. Even if mind does not have a strictly causal role to play in physical bodily processes, its ubiquity in evolved organisms suggests that it is valuable for some reason, even if we cannot yet understand it scientifically. This work is focused on the structure of the mind rather than the structure of the brain. The brain is an immensely complex organism, and the physicality of the brain presents no clear structure like that of the mind. The brain structure is contingent, whereas the mind is eloquent in its mysteriousness. Neuroscience has mapped out regions of the brain and deconstructed chemical compositions, but fails to elucidate a meaningful structure. Mind activities are only associated with brain regions, and emotions have failed to be easily associated with brain structures. Ideas like the central reptilian brain have become outdated, and such an idea can be understood as a projection of idealized structure onto the brain. Even if neuroscientists could officially map out emotion circuits in the brain, there would still be a disconnect between that structure and the structure of emotions as they are experienced subjectively. There is something elucidating in the homuncular model that can be extracted from it, which is metaconsciousness. Instead of an infinite regress of minds, metaconsciousness can be understood recursively. Representations build upon representations in the mind as first-order observation becomes second-order, then third-order, and so on. The developed mind not only is aware of phenomena, but is meta-aware of phenomena through awareness of awareness. On the first page of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the titular character wakes up from his cave, steps out into the sun, and exclaims, "Great star, what would your happiness be if you had not those for whom you shine?" The sun itself is not capable of happiness, but as the bringer of all life, it is the source of all happiness. The sun must be anthropomorphized to ascribe happiness to it, because happiness, as an emotion, is a subjective experience. The passage beautifully highlights the need for subjectivity in the world and the reductivism of the epiphenomenal or automaton models. The physical sun cannot express happiness if it weren't for the subjective agents who experience the sun as a representation. What the preceding discussion has determined is that an emotion is an ideal phenomenon, but not everyone agrees with this assessment of what an emotion is. In What is an Emotion, William James writes, "If we fancy some strong emotion, and then try to abstract from our consciousness of it all the feelings of its characteristic bodily symptoms, we find we have nothing left behind, no mind stuff out of which the emotion can be constituted, and that a cold and neutral state of intellectual perception is all that remains." This physicalist-oriented approach to emotions confuses bodily symptoms, which are objective, for sensations, which are subjective representations of bodily states. Sensations are ideal, but that does not mean they are made out of mind stuff. Such a conception of mind is a misuse of categorical analysis. Substance, or stuff, is a category of thought that is a tool for understanding the material world. Substance or material simply does not apply to mind because it is subject to different categories. Mind cannot be ignored simply because it does not fit all categories. Instead, mind has being because it is subject to categories. In particular, mind and emotions express being in the form of degree and modality. Because there is a distinct, ideal observation of what it is like to feel an emotion, emotions have epistemic qualities. Much like an understanding of the science of color will never replace the knowledge of seeing red, no understanding of the brain or body could replace the knowledge of the phenomenal experience of emotion. This is because of the qualia of emotion. Without qualia, without ideality, emotions would have no epistemic qualities. Knowledge is restricted to being, and the epistemological dimension of emotions gives them being, not to be confused with materiality or substance. James's description of a cold and neutral state of intellectual perception, while lacking the dimension of qualia, does highlight a division within mental phenomena. The mind features an abstract, sensory aspect and a linguistic, intellectual aspect. James's vision of emotions implies that there does not exist a sensory component of the mind corresponding to emotional feeling, a conclusion that goes against basic introspection and phenomenology. Introspection reveals that the mind has many parts, despite those parts not being physical. This does not mean that mind is a simple, as the category of simple should not apply to immaterial entities. The plurality of the mind means that emotions, as sensory data, exist in a context of other active mental processes. Emotions have contextuality. Loneliness, for example, takes advantage both of a sensory feeling of sadness and an intellectual awareness and understanding of the situation of being isolated. Similarly, grief is a sadness combined with an awareness of a loss. This does not mean that sadness is a simple emotion and grief is complex. Sadness is also contextual, but its contextuality is framed by narrativity that corresponds more directly to common perception. An emotional sensation and the awareness of that sensation are not divorceable. Emotions are awareness. As mentioned earlier, emotions express their being in degree and modality. This is a way of understanding what something is in terms of how it applies to the categories. First introduced by Aristotle, the categories are a way of separating the ways in which something can be predicated. Aristotle's categories are both linguistic and metaphysical, in that a category like substance both expresses the structure of language and the world. Aristotle did not make a firm distinction between the two. The concept of categories was refined by Immanuel Kant, who identified the categories with pure concepts of the understanding. This means that the ideality of experience is determined by the categorical structure independent of the external world. I do not make claims here about where the categories lie, whether they are immanent, meaning in the world, transcendent, meaning beyond the world, or transcendental, meaning at the boundary of experience. I also do not think there are truly precise classifications of the categories available in words. I only stress that it is apparent that the world does have structure and that the categories are a way of understanding the presentation of being within that structure. Categorical analysis is necessary because emotions, or mind, are irreducible to component parts. The mind is a plurality without parts. Because the particular classification of categories is not an exact science, instead of relying on Aristotle's or Kant's models, I will propose my own that will best suit understanding emotions. To do this, I must clarify a distinction in how the study of being can be classified. Ontic, or ontology, refers to particular features of being something has as it relates to noumenality. This is contrasted with ontological, or ontology, which here is used to focus on phenomenality. Ontological is used as dichotomous with ontic rather than encompassing as it sometimes is. The categories I proposed are distinguished as pertaining to ontical or ontological features of being. In the ontic section, I recognize the categories of transform, definition, material, and efficiency. In the ontological section, I recognize the categories of degree, modality, affordance, and finality. We can explore these categories by trying to understand a cup. The cup has a transform, which is its source of ontic instantiation in world space. As an ontic object, the cup exists at a particular point in space, and that is because it is susceptible to the category of transform. The cup is on a desk. This feature of the cup is what allows it to make transformations along the dimensionality of the world. The cup can slide across the desk by following its transformation. But the cup's transformation is not complete without understanding its definition. The definition is the instantiated values on the transform of the cup, which give it form. Extension is a manifestation of definition that transforms the object from a point in space to a defined object occupying space. The cup has extension, following the figure of a cup, including a bowl and a handle. The transform and definition work together to provide the cup with ontic primary properties. We will continue to look at the cup's ontic features with the categories of material and efficiency. Material gives the cup its solidity and fills in the definition of the cup with matter. When we see an object, we only see the surface of that object. If we split the cup in two to reveal its insides, we would still only be looking at the surface of what was the inside. Insideness is completely noumenal. Efficiency expresses the material dependency of an object. The cup is dependent upon the atoms that comprise its material composition. The cup, as an ontic object, is also dependent upon time, which gives the material of the cup its historicity. With the ontic categories of the cup understood, we can explore its ontological categories. Degree is the source of an object's ontological instantiation and unity. We know the cup has degree because it is perceptible to our senses and knowledge. The cup therefore has being. Modality is the plurality of that degree which expresses properties. The particular color of the cup is how degree manifests modality as qualia. The color of the cup is a secondary property, meaning it only exists as phenomena in the mind, making it ontological. Finalizing the ontological categories are affordance and finality. Affordance refers to the possibilities of an object. A cup has functionality in its ability to hold and transfer liquid, and also has wider affordances like its ability to be thrown or smashed. Finality is the purpose of an object, which gives it definition within the space of possibilities. The cup, as an object in the mind, only has value as meaning, and without that meaning, the object lacks the transformative properties of media. It is easy to fill out a categorical analysis of a cup because it is both a material object in the world with ontic features and a perceived object in the mind with ontological features. We can analyze an object's predicative categorization to understand it, or more broadly, we can look for the categorical profile of an object, meaning the profile of which categories apply to the object at all. Physical objects like the cup have a full categorical profile, but mind, as ideality, is more complicated. Mind is susceptible to all of the ontological categories. Mind is experienced as a degree of being. That degree of consciousness has modality in its plurality of experiences that degree can be expressed as. Mind has affordances in its ability to think and perceive stimuli, and has finality in its purpose to direct experience. Mind is not susceptible to all of the ontic categories. Mind has no transform or definition, which is evident in its lack of place in space and lack of extension. Mind also does not have material or substance in contemporary views, but used to be viewed as a substance distinct from matter, which is called dualism. The only ontic category that applies to mind is efficiency, because the mind is dependent upon the ontic instantiation of the brain. The ontic dimension of mind differentiates mind from other seemingly abstract objects like numbers, which traditionally have no ontic efficiency in the world and cannot be instantiated. From a Platonist view of numbers, which dominated philosophy until the rise of analytic philosophy, numbers are otherworldly, eternal forms that transcend the world and therefore have no ontic features. This view changed with the analytic approach to numbers, which conceptualizes numbers as classes or sets which have their being in the world. Under the analytic view, if there were only 10 objects in the world, the numbers 11 and 12 would refer to the null class because of their ontic efficiency in the world. Additionally, what might be considered a property of a number, such as being odd, can be expressed in the form of a function. For example, the number 7 is odd not because of a property inherent to 7, but only because the function 7 modulus 2 equates to 1. In this way, numbers have affordance rather than modality as properties. A number's index in a series is also an affordant property because it is not intrinsic to a number to have an index. The number 1 is not intrinsically first, as it is just as logical to be second when counting with a 0 index. The purpose of categorical analysis is to explore all aspects of being, and when we do this, we see that objects can be instantiated in different ways with different categorical profiles. It is the different types of instantiation that allow us to categorize and understand the world. This is a holistic approach that seeks to understand being in the various ways it is presented to us without preconceptions of what reality is supposed to be like. That is the problem with eliminative materialism, which, in its more extreme forms, denies even the existence of qualia. The materialist approach is rooted in a cognitive model of the world based solely on ontic categories, such as material, and assumes that for anything to be considered real, it must conform to those categories. But being exists categorically beyond ontology. The expression of mind in the form of degree and modality, and its efficient link to the ontic world, make mind irreducible to material states in the brain. Furthermore, eliminative materialism ignores the cogito, which is foundational to epistemology. According to the cogito, I think therefore I am, you cannot deny your own existence without absurdity. When we try to specify what the I is in the cogito, we realize that sense data, like qualia, is precisely what is affirmed by the self-evidence of existence. The categories pertain to things within the universe, and not the universe itself or things beyond it. If we attempt to do a categorical analysis of the universe, the most apparent problem is that the universe contains no transformation. The universe is not in space, but rather contains all that is space. There is debate about how much can coherently be said about the universe as a whole, some denying that you can make propositions about the whole at all. This is because the universe, even as an abstraction, expresses ideal characteristics. Just because the universe, as a whole, exhibits ideal characteristics does not mean that the universe truly is ideal or made of mind. The universe as an ideal object can still be said to have self-contained monadic relational features like expansion and entropy, which demonstrates how you can have a plurality without parts, similar to mind. The purpose of this work is to analyze and systematize the structure of emotions, but that raises the question of whether or not emotions have a structure at all. Structure is more apparent for objects than for subjects because of the physically observable and measurable nature of the external world. Subjective phenomena are not measurable and are not comparable across people because of their private nature. However, while emotions might seem structurally elusive at first glance, other subjective experiences like color and sound do exhibit discernible structures. The color wheel, for instance, serves as both a phenomenological structure that organizes subjective experience and a physical structure grounded in optics. Similarly, sound can be ordered along a spectrum of pitch from high to low, correlating subjective perception with measurable frequency. Given the principle of sufficient reason, it follows that emotions must have some form of physical structure in the brain, yet it is unclear to what extent the subjective, neural structure maps onto the phenomenological structure of emotions. If I fail to discern the true structure of emotions, at least I can attempt to provide the most logically sound tool for understanding emotions available. An objection to comparing emotions to color and sound is that conventionally, the mind is considered to be something separate from the sense organs. But this is not a universal model. In Buddhism, the 6 sense bases, or satayatana, are comprised of the 5 Western senses along with mind. If a sense is defined by a process of inputs and outputs from the material world to the subjective world, then mind is undoubtedly a sense organ. The epistemological method by which we determine the identity of an object or phenomenon is classification through association. A class is a collection of items grouped together by shared properties, and it is this that forms the foundation of logic. Particularly in classical logic, truth claims are derived from the interplay of classes, as can be seen with the aid of Venn diagrams. We can learn about what an emotion is by classifying it relative to similar things. As discussed above, an emotion is a psychosomatic sensation with an ideal existence in the form of a modality of consciousness. However, there are other phenomena matching this description, such as appetite, arousal, and pain. These phenomena are rarely confused for emotions, in part due to the greater focus on somatic causality. One feels appetite when lacking bodily sustenance, arousal when experiencing sexual bodily changes, and pain when bodily injured. Emotions, on the other hand, lack a direct bodily cause and are more directly associated with the mind and brain. This view is not shared by everyone, including William James, whose James Lange theory of emotions states that bodily changes occur prior to and provoke emotions. Although it is hard in our materialist world to assign causality to emotions, the James Lange theory overemphasizes the role of physicality in emotions. Even without direct causality, it is clear that emotions have an informative role to play in shaping our actions. If, when encountering a bear, our reaction is first to run and then to get scared, emotions are redundant and purposeless. It is more likely to me that emotions were developed for an evolutionary purpose to guide consciousness through modality. When attempting to create a class representing emotions, we can omit appetite, arousal, and pain, but there is still more specificity needed to separate emotions from other sensations. What separates the emotions from other sensations is affect. Emotions are the affective quality of consciousness. Affects are unified by featuring tonal character. Sensations like pain are often correlated with tonal affects, like anger or fear, but this is only because sensations sometimes are accompanied by emotions sharing a cause. Pain in itself lacks an affective dimension. This distinction underscores that while sensations like appetite, arousal, and pain may be associated with emotions in certain contexts, they should not be considered emotions in their own right. By framing emotions as the affective quality of consciousness, we capture their unique identity and role in shaping human experience through a multidimensional interplay of mind and body. Even still, this categorization is imperfect. When trying to distinguish emotions any more thoroughly, it becomes clear that emotions are not a natural kind. A natural kind refers to a categorical distinction that exists beyond human subjectivity. For example, bushes are not a natural kind distinct from trees because they lack a fundamental, objective separation. Bushes are a linguistic phenomenon based on perceived size and shape, but nothing more. Although we can group emotions together based on their tonal and affective quality, a verifiable true list of what is and is not an emotion can never be decided upon. Emotions as we know them in language are in a state of objectification. As ideal phenomena, emotions are fundamentally abstract. They exist as indiscrete, non-spatiotemporal, subjective sensory content. Emotions become discrete entities when they are objectified by the mind and transformed into lexical units. Because of this, it is not meaningful to separate emotions into what are called basic emotions. The theory of basic emotions states that emotions can be classified into universally recognizable distinct categories that form the basis of more complex emotions, which are species of basic ones. Basic emotions, as a theory, assumes that the ideality of emotions works in terms of physical objects with discrete boundaries and definition. The idea of basic emotions is derived from the empirical sciences, which are limited to studying behavior. The psychologist Paul Ekman recognizes 6 basic emotions derived from researching facial expressions and their recognition by various demographics. But as we have discussed, emotions are not behaviors. They are ideal phenomena that manifest in behaviors. Ekman's behavioral approach treats the structure of facial expressions as if it were the structure of emotions themselves. But this is flawed because the structure of the human face and its muscles are a contingent physical structure untethered to the structure of emotions as they present themselves through ideality. We shouldn't fall into the behaviorist trap of thinking that your smile is your happiness. Instead of analyzing the structure of physical expressions, we can compare emotions to other subjective phenomena like colors. The structure of colors, as understood by color theory in optics, is an indiscrete continuum forming a wheel. When we speak of the color blue, we are extracting from the gradient of qualia a lexical unit that partitions off a piece of the overall structure. The lexeme blue is an object of the mind, in that it is a discrete unit with meaning and definition, but the actual spectrum of color does not feature such a distinction. Blue is not a natural kind. It cannot be separated from its analogous colors of cyan and purple in any concrete way. Every language and culture partitions off the spectrum of color to create their own unique cognitive model with their own interpretation of where the separations between colors lie. It would be foolish to suppose that there is such a thing as basic colors, just because colors can be recognized by various cultures. If we showed a swatch of blue to people of 2 different cultures, they may each have a word to label the color, but that is only because they both have a word corresponding to a range of qualia at which the particular swatch of blue is positioned. The ranges themselves are not identical, and therefore the color words are not either. In Japanese, traditionally there was no distinction between what we would call blue and green, leading to the phenomenon of traffic lights being called ao or blue, despite their appearance. This shows that the color blue is not basic, despite being capable of identification and labeling. Emotions similarly exist on a spectrum of sensation, and just because happiness can be identified in language doesn't mean that it is meaningfully separable from its own analogous emotional sensations. Although emotions are indiscrete phenomena, there still must be labels assigned to emotions to objectify them into words for use, but we should not be tricked into thinking that the structure of language is the structure of emotion. When we think impressionistically, we use inherent sense to form intuitions as thought. And when we think lexically, we use linguistic units to form concrete ideas. This means that although language is not the strict boundary of thought, it does inform the way we think about things. Returning to the structure of color, it is readily apparent the ways in which the structure of language is projected onto the world. In English, there are distinct words for orange and brown, representing different colors. This leads people who haven't studied color theory to fail to recognize that brown is a shade of orange, despite being readily able to identify dark blue as a shade of blue because of the name. For historical and scientific reasons, the hues of cyan and magenta have been excluded from the color wheel in common language. For this reason, people commonly mistake cyan for light blue and magenta for pink, despite cyan and magenta referring to hue changes. A trained artist can see past language and culture to perceive colors as they actually are according to theory. For these reasons, we cannot use language as a guide to the structure of emotions. In the Russian language, there is a word, razblyuto, referring to a bittersweet emotion of longing for someone despite a romantic love having faded. There is no single word to describe this in English, and it can only be linguistically expressed in English through longer description. Like how color words across language still refer to the same underlying spectrum of color, an English speaker can still experience razblyuto, but they lack an immediate lexical codification of such an emotion. If we attempted to understand emotions by analyzing the English language, we would fail to account for emotions like razblyuto. The structure of linguistic emotion is contingent upon the cultural history of the language and is not developed by any kind of theory. In The Passions of the Soul, father of modern philosophy René Descartes identifies what he considers to be the 6 primitive passions: wonder, love, hate, desire, joy, and sadness. He states in Article 69 that all the other passions are composed of some of these 6 or a species of them. For example, when someone esteems an object less than themselves, the emotion is labeled a simple affection. When esteemed higher, it is labeled devotion, and when in between, it is labeled friendship. These are all species of love. What this demonstrates is that emotions are combinative and contextual. Although Descartes' system lacks a structure in favor of enumeration, there is still a method in the way the emotions are accounted for. Wonder comes first because it occurs when we encounter an object we do not yet understand and therefore cannot evaluate in terms of valence. Descartes explains that love and hatred come next because we have love for an object that is judged to be good and hatred for an object that is judged to be bad. Desire is aimed at acquiring or preserving a good and avoiding an evil. The consideration of a present good causes joy, and a present evil causes sadness. Wonder, in Descartes' system, is the only passion without a valence, meaning a relation to good and bad. Descartes' system is an example of what I call the normative disposition towards emotions. Emotions are tied directly to their valence and judgments of good and bad. Descartes' book also has an interesting discussion of the mind-body problem. He defines the passions as perceptions or sensations or excitations of the soul which refer to it in particular and which are caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movement of the spirits. Descartes believed that the mind or soul in the body interacted through the pineal gland because of its position symmetrically in the brain. Animal spirits in the body are derived from the soul and are the source of emotional excitation. Animal spirits are the connection between subject and object. This view is obviously antiquated, but there is something perceptive in associating emotions with excitations and movement. Emotions are processes and are experienced as movements, whether bodily or metaphorical. Shortly after Descartes wrote The Passions of the Soul, Benedict de Spinoza published his Ethics, which features its own systematization of emotion. Spinoza's approach is the penultimate example of the normative disposition towards emotions. Spinoza states that he only acknowledges 3 affects: desire, joy, and sadness. Emotions in this system have an existence completely linked to normative standards. Joy is defined as a man's passage from a lesser to a greater perfection, and likewise sadness is defined as a man's passage from a greater to a lesser perfection. There is an implied structure to the system being a binary relationship of joy and sadness, with desire acting as a contextualizer. I fail to understand what perfection could possibly mean other than a projection of normativity. The hypernormativity of Spinoza is a reflection of his underlying monistic metaphysics, in which a lack of plurality restricts emotions to normative judgments. The normative disposition towards emotion is coherent with a monotheistic worldview in which goodness is considered some form of ideal object, such as being identified with/as God. This is in contrast to polytheistic religion, in which a plurality of ideal objects represents a plurality of associations. I call the pluralistic approach the aesthetic disposition towards emotions. It is the aesthetic perspective on emotions that is lacking from the analysis of many Western philosophers like Descartes and Spinoza. Spinoza's Ethics also features an interesting discussion of desire and how it relates to normativity. Spinoza writes, "It is clear that we neither strive for, nor will, neither want nor desire anything because we judge it to be good. On the contrary, we judge something to be good because we strive for it, will it, want it, and desire it." Unlike Platonists, who locate normative standards in the world or beyond it, Spinoza locates them in the mind. There is nothing that is intrinsically good, only things judged to be good through desire. Desire is the source of normativity, and it is clear that Spinoza desires joy and is averse to sadness. The aesthetic disposition towards emotion is not completely lost on Western philosophers, as exemplified by Friedrich Nietzsche. Through his breakdown of Western ethics, Nietzsche criticizes the normativity of Christianity and the way it models the affects in culture. Christianity enforces moderation of the passions, which shackles people to banality. Instead, Nietzsche proposes a radically aesthetic approach to life full of creativity and drive, motivated by passion, especially passion derived from the arts. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche analyzes a dichotomy between Apollonian, representing logic and order, and the Dionysian, representing passion and intoxication. The Apollonian is indicative of the normative disposition towards emotion, and the Dionysian is indicative of the aesthetic disposition. He famously writes in section 5, "It is only as an aesthetic phenomena that the existence of the world is eternally justified." What would the value of truth, beauty, and goodness be if it weren't for the imperfect human agent who achieves them through struggle here on earth? Life is saturated with richness by the existence of modality of experience, as expressed by art, whereas normativity collapses all modality into a polarity lacking multidimensionality. Other emotional classification systems utilize visual structure to show how emotions are related and express contextuality. One popular approach to explaining emotions is the feeling wheel. This is a 3-layered circular diagram that labels basic emotions at the center and more complex emotions moving outward. There are many versions of the feeling wheel floating around the internet, and not all are made equal. When Google searching for the feeling wheel, the first results are of a butcherized version of the diagram. This version is centered around the emotions happiness, sadness, disgust, anger, fear, bad, and surprise in that order. And that order is completely arbitrary. The point of a wheel structure is to visually demonstrate the analogous relationships between emotions, but that is impossible in this model. Most obviously, happiness should not be placed right next to sadness because those emotions represent a polarity of valence. Additionally, bad is a normative term, not an emotion. The purpose of an emotion system is to elevate emotional awareness and vocabulary, and bad undermines this. Most importantly, the arrangement of color is arbitrary and does not conform to the continuum of the color wheel. As a designer, this wheel is simply uncomfortable to look at, which is not aided by the fact that all of the text is rotated. The far superior version of the feeling wheel was originally introduced by Gloria Wilcox in her paper, A Tool for Expanding Awareness of Emotions and Increasing Spontaneity and Intimacy. Not only does this version actually conform to the color wheel, but the structure of the words chosen is superior as well. Her model focuses on joy, power, peace, sadness, anger, and fear in that order. This selection of words more naturally flows into each other, and there is a greater breadth of expression for positively associated emotions. The ordering is not perfect though, especially the transition from joyful to scared. Wilcox based her primary emotions on the primitives of scared, sad, mad, and glad, but wisely decided to break down glad into the related terms peaceful and powerful. There is a tendency in Western culture to overemphasize happiness as the sole source of positive energy, and this leads to missing the valuable range of more subtle yet positive emotions as exhibited by this wheel. Despite these superior features, Wilcox's model is insufficient for a deep and philosophical understanding of emotions. Her essay introducing the model is only a couple of pages long and presents the model more as a therapy tool than as a psychological model. The new model I am developing here will take inspiration from the better features of the feeling wheel, but will be more enriched by theory. A similar but more psychologically robust circular model of emotions is Robert Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions. This model recognizes the 8 emotions of joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation, arranged radially conforming to an accurate color wheel presented as radiating leaves. Yellow is even appropriately placed at the top of the wheel, just as Newton placed it on his color wheel to reflect the sun. The chosen primitive emotions are arrived at in part through factor analysis, as seen in this figure from the paper A General Psychoevolutionary Theory of Emotion. The extended emotions featured here form clusters of association as analyzed from survey data, and the results demonstrate both analogy and opposition. From this figure, if collapsed into universals, we can see the emergence of a loose wheel pattern, and it is this pattern that is reflected in Plutchik's emotion model. Similar to the feeling wheel, this model is organized into 3 layers, but instead of complexity, the layers unfold in terms of intensity. Serenity is a low-intensity joy, and ecstasy is a high-intensity joy. Unlike the feeling wheel, there is not only a reasonable continuum of analogy, but also proposed opposition in leaves facing across from each other. Most agreeably, joy is the opposite of sadness. The last feature of this model is blended emotions, seen between any 2 analogous leaves. It can be logically seen how joy mixed with trust can result in love, because it is through both trust in a partner and the experience of joy in the partner's presence that the feeling of love emerges in a relationship. While I appreciate the rigor of Plutchik's approach, it is not without flaws. The most apparent problem is that the gradient established by the wheel is not continuous in terms of valence or arousal. Particularly, the positioning of fear, a distinctly negative emotion, intersects trust and surprise, which, especially when considered in the form of admiration and amazement, are positively connotative. It could even be said that the analogous emotions of fear and trust are actually polar opposites of each other. Fear is an aversion towards an object viewed as dangerous, whereas trust is an inclination towards an object viewed as harmless. Additionally, this placement of fear is not even consistent with his factor analysis results. Regarding arousal, the emotions ecstasy, rage, amazement, and terror are considered highly arousing, but the ordering of the wheel does not align these items. The justification for these placements is an emphasis on perceived pairs of opposition. Plutchik elaborates that anger and fear are opposites in the sense that one implies attack and the other flight. Joy and sadness are opposites in the sense that one implies possession or gain, while the other implies loss. Acceptance and disgust are opposites in the sense that one implies a taking in and the other implies an ejection or riddance. Surprise and anticipation are opposites in the sense that one implies the unpredictable and the other implies the predictable. The rules by which oppositions are established are inconsistent. Notably, fight or flight response associated with anger and fear is a behavioral response rather than a phenomenological characteristic, which is where the structure of emotions lies. There is also inconsistency in that anticipation is the only temporal emotion, being by definition future-oriented, with no other emotion being like this. There is also the question of whether factor analysis is really an appropriate tool for discerning the structure of emotions. Analyzing survey data is a form of consensus, and it reflects culture and language rather than rational or phenomenological structure. There is an additional expanded version of Plutchik's model that omits the intensity layers and adds many curved lines connecting all elements that are 2 or 3 elements close to each other. This version of the model, unwieldy as it is to look at, is an attempt to expand upon the concept of blended emotions, like that of joy and trust forming love. What is missing here is the blended relationship between polar emotions. Joy and sadness, despite being considered polar opposites, can absolutely be felt in tandem with each other, as in the feeling of bittersweetness. Anger and fear can also easily be combined, as when someone is ill-treated by a hated and feared enemy. A more intuitive and visually appealing approach would be to use a radial graph to demonstrate the way any set of emotions, even more than 2 at a time, can emerge. The last visual model of emotions to discuss is the arousal valence model of emotion. This model is sometimes displayed as a circle, like the previous models, but the square version is more fitting for the two-dimensional axial structure it contains. The two axes are labeled with valence horizontally and arousal vertically. Valence refers to the degree of pleasantness of an emotion, and arousal refers to the energy or intensity of that emotion. What makes this system appealing is how intuitive and memorizable it is. Emotions like happiness and delight can be placed in the region of high valence and high arousal, whereas sadness and depression can be placed in the region of low valence and low arousal. That being said, the model overemphasizes the role of valence and categorizing emotions as an expression of the normative disposition towards emotions. A complex feeling like bittersweetness cannot be placed anywhere on the graph because, while at the surface level it is a sadness, the metaconscious awareness of such an emotion is a happiness about that sadness. The arousal valence model is limited to simple emotions and simple interpretations of emotions. Additionally, the dimension of arousal only applies to stereotypes of emotions and does not accurately model the way emotions are actually experienced in practice. Sadness is placed in the low arousal region, as opposed to anger in the high arousal, but sadness can be highly arousing depending on its intensity and context. When someone bawls their eyes out in intense sorrow, they clearly are experiencing a high degree of arousal, but such a state is barred from being captured in this model. Now that we have analyzed the existing systems of emotion, we can start to construct a new, superior model. A complete model of emotions should feature a gradient of related emotions, express both normative and aesthetic dispositions towards emotion, and have room for a wide variety of emotional contextuality. To do this, we must first understand the ontology of an emotion. Emotions are a modality of consciousness, and a modality is a relation. Degree is the instantiated presence of a phenomenon, and the relational content of that degree is what transforms it into a sensible modality. This means that emotions are relations. In conventional philosophy, emotions are considered dyadic relations, meaning a relation between two entities, a subject and its intentional object. Intentionality refers to the directedness or aboutness of mental states towards something. The existing philosophy of emotions largely overemphasizes the role of intentionality in emotions by defining emotions in terms of intention. If someone experiences happiness while eating ice cream, conventionally, the ice cream would be what the happiness is about. But how can an abstract sensation of happiness be about anything? How can a person possibly be happy about a physical object when it is the subjective experience contained within the subject that causes the pleasure of happiness? The aboutness of an emotion is always aimed inward, towards the subject itself. Happiness when eating ice cream is a metaconscious awareness of the sensory pleasure inducing the happiness. As discussed above, emotions are fundamentally abstract, and because of this, they lack intentionality. An abstract sensation exists prior to intentionality, and it is only the linguistic/intellectual aspect of mind that is capable of intention. Lower-level sensory emotions lack intentionality because they exist as relations in themselves, not relations towards understandable objects. Emotions can more fundamentally be understood as monadic relations, relations of one. Unlike a physical object, the mind, as an ideal, immaterial entity, is not comprised of discrete parts. Nonetheless, mind features many aspects, both conscious and unconscious, which act in tandem to create the emergence of consciousness. Without these many aspects, without energy and motion, the mind would be nothing at all. In this way, the mind is a plurality without parts. Emotions are one of these aspects. Emotions manifest from the immaterial motion of mental parts, all contained within the unity of the mind. In this way, we can see that emotions are a relation of parts, a monadic relation of self-contained parts. The human subject is trapped in their own subjectivity without access to the external, noumenal world. What the mind understands and interacts with are not objects in themselves, but only representations of objects as mediated by the structure of the mind. This is why emotions are monadic rather than intentional. They exist as a relation between the mind and its own representations. It is meaningless to speak of fear of a bear in itself, only fear of an idea or representation of a bear. All emotions, including desire, are intentional only insofar as they intend upon representations. Instead of mapping out emotions onto a graph directly, we can use the underlying relational content of emotions as a way of seeing how emotions, as monadic relations, blend into one another. What I propose here is called the wheel of relation. This is a radial model of monadic relations that seamlessly forms a gradient that both blends together circularly and expresses polar relations. Starting with the top and bottom dyad of yellow and blue, we can see expansion at the top of the wheel and contraction at the bottom. These labels can be considered literally or metaphorically. Expansion is a relation of outward motion, a state of openness and energy flow, whether physical, mental, or emotional, with an amplification of presence. Contraction, on the other hand, is a relation of inward motion, a state of reductionary and concentrated energy. Neither is inherently positive or negative. Instead, they present an opposition of relational balance. Expansion is yellow because the color is associated with energy, openness, and vibrancy. It illuminates like the sun, which itself radiates outward with expansion. Contraction is blue because the color represents containment, cooling, and stability, like the ocean, which pulls inward with contraction. The horizontal dyad allots entropy to the left and negentropy to the right. Entropy is a state of chaotic motion that destroys order, whereas its opposite, negentropy, builds order by negating chaos. Negentropic relations are patternless and harmonious, whereas entropic relations are disparate and disharmonious. Entropy is magenta because the color embodies instability and chaotic energy. Unlike spectral colors, magenta exists as a synthetic union of red and blue, demonstrating a forced coexistence of opposites without smooth transition. Magenta carries a feeling of intensity and unpredictability. Negentropy is green because it symbolizes equilibrium, structure, and coherence. In nature, green can be seen in thriving ecosystems full of healthy organic matter. These four relations, comprising the orthogonal axes, make up the primary relations. In between them, on the diagonal axes, lie the secondary relations. Between expansion and negentropy, there is connection. Connection as a relational motion is both expansionary and negentropic. Connection is orderly, but has a higher expansionary energy than strictly negentropic relations. It is expansion of component parts that allows for connections or associations to be made between elements. Connection is represented with the color sap, because the color embodies binding force. In nature, sap carries nutrients and facilitates growth, and the color brings vitality and organic integration. The opposite of connection is disconnection in the bottom left. Disconnection is both entropic and contractionary. The entropic aspect breaks apart the ordering of elements, and the contractionary aspect dissociates elements from having expansionary meaning. When elements are contracted together, they lose their distinctness, forcing them to form an undifferentiated mass. Disconnection is purple because the color represents detachment, mystery, and ambiguity. Purple is neither warm nor cool, existing in a liminal space between the two. Lastly, there is the secondary dyad of tension and release. Tension lies in between entropy and expansion. It is expansionary in its outward directedness and entropic in its sense of chaos. Tension allows for elements to expand into distinct elements, but does so in a way that disrupts patterns. Tension is red because the color embodies urgency, intensity, and danger. Red is the color of heat and friction, which are examples of tension in the physical world. The opposite of tension in the bottom right corner is release. Release is both negentropic and contractionary. Release brings the harmonious elements of negentropy in a more structured and relaxed whole because of its relation to contraction. It purges tension by contracting elements together into stability without fully disintegrating their distinction. Release is cyan because the color embodies levity and clarity. Cyan is gentle, but not without an energy of its own. Cyan rarely appears in nature, but is analogous to a soothing, slow inhalation, which contracts into a harmonious whole before being exhaled. Finally, there is the middle portion of the wheel, which is labeled as stillness, and can be thought of as the color gray. All of the relational hues are relations of motion, and the outward degree of each relation represents the saturation or degree of the relation. As relations move inward, they lose their intensity and disintegrate into indistinct stillness. No relation, if it is considered to have being, can be truly still, because then it would cease to be an entity, but relations start to resemble stillness as they lose their saturation. A feature of this layout is that no relations, even opposing ones, are contradictory, and any overall relation can be expressed through a radial mapping of relevant regions. Now that the wheel of relation is understood as a whole, the organic radial gradient can be clearly seen. Expansion blends into connection as it forms an ordering of expanded elements, and connection becomes negentropy as those elements reach their maximum degree of order and pattern. Release then follows as ordered elements ease into a relaxed state until settling into a full state of contraction. Next, those contracted elements start to break apart into a dissociated state of disconnection until they completely disperse into chaos in the form of entropy. As entropy expands, it forms packets of high energy relation, causing tension. Tension wraps back around to expansion, and the cycle continues. The wheel of relation is both a metaphysical tool and an intuitive system for understanding any dynamic relation or process. If we think in terms of vibrations, the wheel of relation can be easily felt in the body and through the material aspect of sensory emotions. The wheel can also be visualized as a series of strings. In this version of the diagram, the relational hues are expressed through vibrational strings corresponding to their respective relations. Expansion is an upward continuous string representing expansion or upward movement. Connection moves upward with expansion, but vibrates smoothly as patterns start to emerge. The negentropic string moves to the right, representing progress, and is also vibrating smoothly, demonstrating harmony. Release is like the connection string, but moves downward, corresponding to contraction. The contraction string is the opposite of the expansion string, as it moves downward continuously. Disconnection introduces jagged vibration, showing dissonance, which is heightened in the entropic string moving to the left, representing regression. Lastly, the tension string moves in the upper left direction, being both jagged and regressive. The relations comprising the wheel of relation are the foundation for understanding emotions and phenomenological states more broadly. At any given time, a person is in a monadic relational state that can be expressed in terms of radial regions on the wheel. The relational profile at a point in time is the synchronic structure of relations. Synchrony is like a snapshot in time, which helps us to comprehend a phenomenon as a static state of affairs. But as we have discussed, the relations expressed in the wheel of relation are inherently dynamic and in motion. A single frame of time is only a human abstraction, and nothing in the world would make sense without process. This is why relations must be understood both synchronically as static in space and diachronically as embodied in time. This can be visualized with the help of a diagram. Here we see a circle labeled synchrony, representing the wheel of relation at a point in time. An arrow pierces through the wheel and is labeled with diachrony, representing linear time. We can imagine the wheel moving through time linearly while changing in relational hue and saturation corresponding to a given phenomenon's state of relation. Synchrony and diachrony work in unison to give us a full view of how relations change with and in time. The lifespan of a given phenomenon is never infinite though, which is why the diagram can also be arranged with fixed start and end points. At the beginning of a phenomenon's life is birth, and ending a phenomenon's life is death. This applies both to human subjects and to physical objects as well. This is because infinity is purely an abstract concept and can never be instantiated in entities beholden to the categories. A point in time moves from birth to death while changing laterally based on its state of relation on the wheel. It can already be seen how the wheel of relation relates to emotions, but by itself, it does not provide a full view of emotional range. For this, it must become understood how the wheel is related to the mind more broadly. The mind, as an immaterial entity, does not have a discernible structure like can be seen in its physical counterpart, the brain. This has not stopped people from trying to derive a structure from observations of subjectivity and its many aspects. The best existing map of the mind is the 3 registers of Jacques Lacan. This is a triadic structure comprised of interconnected mental registers labeled as the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. If we think of a piece of music, we can see how all of the 3 registers apply to a given phenomenon. The sheet music of, and the music theory behind, a piece of music is symbolic. Equal temperament tuning divides the continuum of acoustic sound into discrete lexemes with symbolic representations as letters. The sheet music displays symbols to stand in for these notes, which must be decoded by an observer with the specialized knowledge of the symbolic code. This is unlike the imaginary aspect of the piece of music, which identifies the experiential dimension. In the imaginary register, the instantiated or performed music becomes an impulse for feeling. A major piece of music makes you feel happy, a minor piece of music makes you feel sad. The emotional response and impression of understanding lies in the imaginary. Lastly, there is the contingent actuality of the music registered by the real. A piece of music is not real until it is actualized by musicians. The musicians must physically touch their sound-generating devices to transform the air into audible vibrations. A real performance is not symbolically quantized to a grid, but features imperfect contingencies that make every instance of the music unique. The three registers is possibly the best established structure of the mind, but it still leaves room for improvement. I would like to expand upon the system while imbuing it with a more phenomenological underpinning. The most obvious feature lacking from Lacan's system is what I call the abstract. The abstract register corresponds to pre-representational meaning, even more primitive than the real. Before any phenomenon can be understood, it must first be processed by the abstract. Emotions, like all phenomena, whether subjective or objective, are fundamentally abstract. Lacan's real partially expresses this, but is tangled up with other ideas that confuse the topic. Both the real and the imaginary carry an element of abstraction, but having a dedicated register adds clarity and better demonstrates the phenomenological acquisition process, which always begins in the abstract. The new system, featuring the abstract at the bottom, is square-shaped and is superimposed by the three registers. We can see in this way that the abstract lies between the real and imaginary and signals a more fundamental source of meaning. The new square shape allows for the registers of the mind to be understood in terms of axes. The symbolic is reused for the top of the structure because it opposes the abstract. This parallels how the mind has a pre-representational, abstract aspect and a linguistic, intellectual aspect. With the vertical axis understood, we can discuss the horizontal dimension. On the left middle of the graph is the formal register. The formal is similar to the real, but reaches halfway into the symbolic. In the formal, the real is contextualized by objectification and narrativity. While the real is pre-representational, the formal register denotes representations of objects as they are understood, not by the symbolic order or meta-narrative, but by the everyday narrative of life. Narrative is necessary for human functioning because it is narrative that transforms fundamentally abstract phenomena into discernible, connected events. Returning to the music example, while the abstract or real refers to the pre-representational contingency of the music, the formal refers to our material understanding of the music. The music must be performed by musicians, who formally interpret the music and embrace their formal identity as musicians to transform the music into something sensible. There is a formal narrative in the fact that the musicians must show up to the recording studio on time with their instruments in hand and having practiced the music to reach competency. It can now be seen how the distinction of abstract and formal work together to help flesh out Lacan's real. The opposite of the formal is the iconic on the right middle of the graph. The iconic is similar to the imaginary, but reaches halfway towards the symbolic. The formal and iconic, sharing a spot on the horizontal middle region of the graph, both represent narrativized phenomena. The iconic is the imaginary contextualized through subjectification and narrativity. While the imaginary is an impressionistic fantasy, an icon is a discrete unit of meaning in the subjective mind, but not quite a symbol. In the imaginary, a piece of music is experienced as a feeling, or rema, whereas in the iconic, music is understood as a representational object of social meaning. In the iconic, musicians understand themselves to be musicians in identity, which is constructed through social relations. Music is understood not as abstract feelings, but as distinct melodies, rhythms, and harmonies. The four vertices, abstract, formal, iconic, and symbolic, form a diamond, and it is inside this diamond that the primary domain of the mind is found. The corners represent the less intuitively understood secondary domain. Understanding the depths of the structure can be helped by explaining what the axes themselves represent. The horizontal axis refers to changes in form, while the vertical axis refers to changes in content. When an entity is experienced from the formal to the iconic, its form changes from an objective, material phenomenon to a subjective, immaterial phenomenon. Formality is constructed through external perception that presents sensibility and coherence in form, while iconicity is constructed through internal perception and simplified form. The vertical axis, in contrast, represents changes in content. Abstract entities are raw and unprocessed phenomena that represent nothing but themselves, whereas symbolic entities are representations of something other than themselves. Symbols, unlike other marks, are stand-ins for something they are not. And in this way, the content of a symbol is radically different from an abstract mark. Both axes, content and form, are expressions of subject-object relations. The abstract is subjective because it represents the starting point of all perception. Human subjects are forever barred from the outside, noumenal world, and because of this, everything sensible to us begins as subjectivity. The opposite of this, symbols, are objective. Here, objective does not refer to the truth value of propositions, but to the way the mind orders experience into mental objects of understanding. Symbols, as discrete units, are objects of the mind. The horizontal axis of form is also determined by subject and object. Formality is objective in the sense that it presents objects of sensibility and understanding to the mind through extroversion. Iconic, on the other hand, is introverted perception focused on the subjective or felt character of an object, as it is represented internally to the mind. Subject and object are complicated terms with many use, and this graph aids in deciphering the varied ways in which they can be used, both formally and contextually. With the axes fully understood, we can label the corners of the graph, which represent the breadth of phenomenal expression of content and form. The labels are subreal in the bottom left, ideal in the bottom right, hyperreal in the top left, and metareal in the top right. Subreal and ideal can easily be understood, since we have already discussed Lacan's real and imaginary, but because they are situated in relation to the abstract, formal, and iconic, they have greater specificity and clarity. Subreal phenomena are both formal and abstract. They are pre-representational, but still material. This is unlike the ideal, which is both iconic and abstract. Abstraction comes in a variety of expressions, ranging in changes of form. A work of abstract art may be subreal if it utilizes light value and perspective to present pre-representational objects of materiality, or it can be ideal if it presents the idealized form of shape and line. Hyperreality is present at the intersection of the formal and the symbolic. This is the region where material objects are interpreted into signs mediated by the symbolic order. In the hyperreal, music is codified into genre definitions that organize the relations of elements into restrictive categories that don't describe the music, but prescribe it. This is opposed to the metareal dimension, which is both iconic and symbolic. Metareality is comprised of symbols mediated through associative experience. Metareal music defies prescriptive genre definitions and can therefore only be described. Lyrics are obviously a symbolic aspect of music, because they are lexical units of content, but they can range in form from hyperreal to metareal. Lyrics can use easily understandable and directly representational words in the hyperreal, or can use metaphor and impressionistic language to appeal to the metareal register. The corners of the graph also involve subject-object relations, but are combinations of the subjectivity and objectivity of the middle axes. The ideal register, as a combination of the subjective abstract and subjective iconic, is subjectively subjective, or SS for short. The subreal register is subjectively objective, or SO. The metareal register is objectively subjective, or OS. And lastly, the hyperreal register is objectively objective, or OO. To further explore the graph, including the inner regions, we can break the graph up into sections. The bottom leftmost region of subjective objectivity, marked by the subreal register, is dissociative. Phenomena in this section are dissociated from meaning and present the facticity of objects. The opposite of dissociation in the top right corner is association. Metareal phenomena arrange symbolic elements into webs of associative meaning. In the bottom right corner, marked by the ideal register, is the region of negation. Ideal forms negate material reality in favor of a purity of subjectivity. Opposed to negation is the top left corner of sublimation. Hyperreal phenomena are reified representations of objects that synthesize reality into symbols with clear meaning. There are also the inner regions to consider. Inward of dissociation is the region of impression. Impressions are slightly dissociated from reality, but still maintain a semblance of meaning. Inward of the negation region is the region of expression. Unlike impressions, which resemble their object filtered through imperfect perception, expression moves in the direction of altering or stylizing objects of perception into more mediated or subjective forms. Inward of the sublimated region is conception. In this region, phenomena are developing into symbols through lexical concepts of the understanding, but are not as rigidly reified into linear terms as in the hyperreal. The greater room for interpretation in this region allows for story and mythos to develop. Lastly, there is the thematic region, which is inward of the associative region. Here, the subjective content of iconic reality is developing into symbols, but are not as widely associative as fully meta-real phenomena. Phenomena in this region are connected through thematic relations prompting interpretation. For a more psychological perspective, the graph can also be viewed as a map to the psyche. The graph can be separated into 3 stacked tiers corresponding to Sigmund Freud's structural model of the psyche. The bottom tier, comprising the subreal, abstract, and ideal, demarcates the id. The id is an unconscious, and therefore abstract, force that underpins a person's identity. The id may seem chaotic, but as Lacan states, the unconscious is structured like a language. There is a pre-representational, pre-lexical language to the id, which is why this tier can be understood as being mediated by the primordial order. One tier higher, comprised of the formal and iconic, is the territory of the ego. Formality and iconicity are above the abstract because they are contextualized by narrativity, and it is narrative that fuels the ego. The ego exists socially, as the relational identity of the subject existing in a society that must be interpreted into sensibility that makes regular life possible. Because of this, the ego is mediated by the social order. The final tier at the top is home to the superego. The superego, related to the big other in Lacan's system, is a symbol of the ego that exists superconsciously. When a person encounters another, they generate a symbol of that person in their mind containing a relation of known or interpreted properties of that person. In a similar way, the superego is a symbolic representation of one's identity. The superego is the voice of normativity as dictated by the symbolic order. With the full phenomenological structure of the mind explained, the wheel of relation can now be applied to the structure to give us a full view of how emotions manifest as relations. The wheel of relation, in its pure form, corresponds to the abstract register of the mind. Relations like expansion or entropy are distinctly pre-representational states of process, capable of manifesting in the mind or body. These relations are the bedrock of emotions and are in themselves considerable as emotions in their most fundamentally abstract state. When manifesting as emotions, they carry a gradient of tonal quality, making them affective. But this is not all of the emotions in the abstract. The wheel of relation, as a circular model of tonal changes, is evident of the aesthetic disposition towards emotions. The abstract relations of the wheel are aesthetic emotions, which is why they can be symbolized in color. There is also the normative disposition to consider in the abstract. Unlike aesthetic emotions, normative emotions form a single linear dimension paralleling the linear distinction between good and bad. The positive arrow of the abstractly normative emotions is desire. Desire is the abstract source of all normativity because it is desire that allows the human agent to form judgments about phenomena. We judge an object to be good if we desire it, and bad if we do not. The opposite of desire is antipathy. One has antipathy for an object normatively judged to be bad. The transform point on the axis, representing the current normative state, is awareness. Desire and antipathy require awareness to be actualized. Awareness is opposed to lack, which is the cause of desire. Through awareness of lack, a person generates desire to fill that lack. Desire in the abstract is not necessarily intentional, because desire does not require an object of desire. Desire is a product of lack, meaning it emerges without consideration for an object. Desire does not originate for an object. Rather, it is projected onto an object through lack. This is why desire can never be satiated. Lack is fundamental to being alive. The aesthetic and normative models work in tandem to give a full view of abstract emotions. Aesthetic emotions like expansion and entropy are tonal and do not carry an element of judgment until combined with normative emotions. We can feel good about negentropy if it is desired, or we can feel good about entropy if that is the emotion desired. Desire is always desire for ideality. People do not desire, say, food for its physical sustenance, but instead for the subjective effect of taste. Food is needed for survival, but people do not desire to survive physically. The desire to continue experiencing life subjectively. When someone desires to possess an object, the desire for the object as a representation to have the ideal property of being mine. Emotions, as the tonal, affective dimension of consciousness, are a primary source of ideal desire. Experiences and objects are desired for the emotions they provide. Lower order emotions in the abstract are the fundamental layer of emotions, and as emotions build up to higher order emotions moving upward on the graph, they transform through degrees of metaconsciousness. For an abstract emotion to become a formal emotion, it must be processed by the mind through a second degree of awareness. At the formal level, this is considered to be focus. When the mind focuses on expansion, the emotion becomes happiness through higher order awareness. This principle functions for all the aesthetic and normative emotions. The formal emotions, in order, are happiness, peace, pride, relaxation, melancholy, fear, shame, and anger. Like expansion becomes happiness through focus, connection becomes peace, negentropy becomes pride, and so on. Formal emotions are the first stage of emotions that are objectified into words commonly considered to be emotions. They are recognizable in their formality and present emotions as known by common, everyday narrative. For example, contraction is a bodily, relational state, and by focusing on that contractionary feeling, the feeling becomes melancholy. The formal aesthetic emotions still work to form a tonal gradient with polarities of opposition. Peace is connection contextualized by formal narrative within the social order, whereas disconnection becomes fear through a focus on dissociation from a phenomenon. The feeling of release, being both orderly and contractionary, becomes relaxation in the formal by being a formal state of focus on release. Tension, on the other hand, becomes anger, which is a state of tension objectified into an extroverted form of focus. Pride and shame best exemplify the reflexive quality of formal emotions. Pride and shame, through reflexive awareness or focus, morph the feelings of negentropy and entropy into a form of tonal self-recognition. In the middle of the aesthetic wheel, stillness becomes apathy. Apathy is a state of neutral formality. On the normative side of formal emotions is the polarity of love and hate. Love is a higher order form of desire, and hate is a higher order form of antipathy. Love and hate, unlike desire and antipathy, are embedded in narrative. It is through focus that an object is loved or hated. Love, in particular, carries extensive baggage in common language. People use love in all sorts of ways, which only serves to diminish the value of the word. In this system, love is understood through formality, as a species of desire contextualized through formal narrative. A person cannot love without narrative because, without the context of social narrative, love is merely desire. The next step in the process of emotional acquisition is the iconic register. This is the register where formal emotions are subjectified into experiential states of affective awareness. These emotions are experienced through engagement. The aesthetic emotions in this register are joy, comfort, harmony, ease, sorrow, discomfort, dissonance, and motivation, in that order. It can be easily seen how joy is the product of subjective, experiential engagement with happiness. This is similar to the relationship of formal melancholy to iconic sorrow. Whereas melancholy pertains to a lasting emotional identity, sorrow is short-lived and experiential. The horizontal emotions of harmony and dissonance lose the reflexive quality of pride and shame. In the iconic register, they become more experiential states of tonal ordering. Comfort, unlike peace, while still being subject to the social order, is subjective and personal. Discomfort is similarly a more introverted form of fear, primarily directed inward. Relaxation becomes ease, as it is subjectively engaged with, and anger becomes motivation. Motivation, like anger, is a species of tension, but carries an iconic sense of experiential drive rather than a directedness of identity. The middle of the iconic wheel is equanimity, which is a state of even temper and calm mind. On the normative side of iconic emotions is the polarity of interest and disinterest. Interest is a species of desire, but is contextualized by engagement rather than awareness. A person engages with a phenomenon of interest by desiring to experience it subjectively. This is opposed to disinterest, which requires engaging in antipathy towards a phenomenon. The last step in the acquisition of emotions within the primary registers is symbolic emotions. Symbolic emotions exist within the symbolic order and in this way are directed towards symbols. Engagement with others is mediated by the symbolic register through ideal representations of others. When a person encounters an other, they form a symbol of that person in their mind, and it is this symbol that dictates symbolic emotions. Delight is not just happiness, but happiness in relation to a symbolic representation of another. Its opposite, pity, is a sorrow in relation to a symbolic other. Pity is a contractionary feeling caused by identification with the sorrow of another. Arrogance and humiliation are similar to pride and shame, but are caused by an over-identification with the symbolic identity of the self. These emotions require a symbolic other to be symbolically esteemed higher or lower than the self. Confidence is similar to comfort, but unlike the engagement of comfort, it requires identification with that feeling, transforming it into a property of identity. Thrill is a higher-order fear that involves a more complicated relationship to the phenomenon feared. Someone can get a thrill out of riding a roller coaster or watching a scary movie, despite being perfectly safe activities, because of the symbolic identification with the fear induced by them. Acceptance is not just a feeling of ease or relaxation, but a symbolic identification with that feeling and its symbolic implications. Ease must be symbolically interpreted to become acceptance. Agitation arises from tension, but is tension with a complex symbol as its cause. Agitation, unlike raw tension, is caused by identification with tension in the higher order register. At the center of the symbolic wheel is humility, which is a state of symbolic neutrality that does not inflate or deflate a person's identity. The normative categories in the symbolic register are appreciation and depreciation. To appreciate a phenomena is not to simply desire it as an object of tangibility, but rather to positively judge its existence for its own sake. A phenomenon must be symbolic for it to have the potential to be appreciated for its very being. Depreciation follows this pattern with negative judgment. The transform point on these emotions is identification. The four sets of emotions discussed comprise the emotions of the primary registers. There are also emotions in the more nuanced secondary registers to consider, starting with the subreal register in the bottom left. These emotions are both abstract and formal. The aesthetic emotions in the subreal register are energetic, belonging, coherence, respite, isolation, alienation, disarray, and restlessness, in that order. Energetic is a more formal version of expansion because it refers to a heightened state of bodily arousal. Similarly, isolation is like contraction, but is a heightened monadic state. Subreal emotions are more material in orientation than purely abstract ones. The subreal version of negentropy and entropy are coherence and disarray, respectively. These emotions also refer to states of order, but are more concrete in their formality. Coherence is an ordering of parts that are formally logical in their arrangement, and disarray is the opposite of that. Belonging and alienation are relational states that flow naturally with isolation. They refer not to one's place in the social or symbolic order, but to the raw feeling that underlies them primordially. Respite and restlessness relate to release and tension, but are more material in orientation. Respite is a state of relief from the tension of life, and restlessness is a state oriented towards that tension. At the center of the wheel is inertia, which is the bodily stillness and neutrality. On the normative side of the subreal is devotion and aversion, and they are actualized by orientation. In the subreal, desire takes on the form of orientation rather than awareness, indicative of the extroversion of formality. When we not only have a desire, but orient ourselves towards that desire, it becomes devotion. Aversion is its opposite. Emotions in the bottom right register of ideal are both abstract and iconic. These emotions are abstract, but also subjectively experienced. Unlike orientation in the subreal register, ideal emotions are transformed by inclination, a desire for union with the object of desire. The ideal emotions are vitality, unity, freedom, serenity, oblivion, caution, denial, and drive. Vitality is an idealized, subjective happiness more primally felt than joy in the iconic. Oblivion is similarly a visceral, idealized sorrow that is more subjective than physical isolation in the subreal. Negentropy is idealized as freedom, and entropy is idealized as denial. Freedom is a harmonious ordering of subjective content into a subjective form. Denial is a rejection of bodily relational states into disorder. Connection becomes unity as connected elements are idealized in form, and disconnection becomes caution as disparate elements are rejected subjectively. Serenity is like release, but is idealized to emphasize the subjective state of calmness. Drive is attention that, unlike the materiality of restlessness, is closer to motivation in its impulse towards subjective action. In the middle of the ideal wheel is numbness, which, as the label suggests, is a stillness that is felt subjectively. The normative ideal emotions are affinity and rejection, defined by inclination. An affinity for something is not just a desire for it, but an inclination to join with that thing, whereas rejection is an inclination to be removed from it. In the top left register of the hyperreal are emotions that are both formal and symbolic. These emotions exist in relation to symbolic others, but are codified into linear terms comprehended by formality. The hyperreal version of expansion is ecstasy. This is hyperreal happiness that is so pure in form that it reaches the sublime. The hyperreal version of contraction is loneliness. Loneliness is similar to isolation from the subreal register, but is contextualized by a relation to symbolic others. Loneliness is a sadness accompanied by a symbolic fixation on a lack of closeness to others. The horizontal dyad in the hyperreal is hubris and guilt. These two emotions are similar to pride and shame in the formal register, but are actualized through fixation, a hyperreal version of focus. Hubris is in the intersection of pride and arrogance, and guilt is in the intersection of shame and humiliation. In the hyperreal, connection becomes trust. This is a connection to a symbolic representation of an other. Paranoia is what fear becomes when it reaches the hyperreal. Paranoia is not directed at a simple object or phenomenon, but is entrenched in symbolic fixation. In a state of paranoia, a person makes dissociative disconnections with elements of the symbolic order and fears that those elements will affect their identity. Release becomes laziness in the hyperreal. This is a symbolic comparison of oneself to an other in relation to release. It is hyperreal to identify with laziness because it is judging oneself to be too released compared to a symbol of how one ought to be. Lastly, there is anxiety, which is hyperreal tension. This emotion, similar to paranoia, is a fixation caused by the interaction of symbols. Anxiety does not have a simple cause like anger does, and is instead the product of being overwhelmed by the tension of symbolic representations. In the middle of the hyperreal wheel is deprivation. This is because when a person lacks hyperreality in their life, they are deprived of cultural legitimacy and the systemic reinforcement of identity. The normative emotions in the hyperreal register are addiction and loathing, with fixation as a transform point. Addiction is desire gone awry with symbols. When a person is addicted to something, they are fixated on it as a symbol that provides artificial fulfillment to their identity. Loathing is the opposite of this, as loathing is not just a hatred of something, but is a hatred of what something represents symbolically. The last region to consider is the meta-real. At the intersection of the iconic and symbolic, there are emotions that take on the role of association. Here, emotions exist in the symbolic order, but unlike hyperreality, they exist in a web of mental connections between representations. The meta-real aesthetic emotions are grace, faith, awe, catharsis, desperation, frenzy, damnation, and fate. It can be seen by these labels that the meta-real register has a mythic or religious undertone. Grace is a joy and symbolic embrace of elevated symbols. Unlike how delight partakes in the sublime, grace partakes in the divine. Desperation is a contraction with similar qualities to oblivion, but is based more on a vacancy of symbolic attachments. Desperation is desperation for symbols. The meta-real version of negentropy is awe. Awe is a feeling of negentropic order inspired by a relation to a divine object or phenomenon. In a state of awe, a phenomenon is embraced because of its harmonious qualities, but without a complete or formal understanding. Damnation is the opposite feeling. In damnation, dissonance is elevated to a divine level, and the entropic relations present in the feeling are symbolified into meta-narrative. In the meta-real, connection becomes faith. Faith is the meta-real counterpart to trust in the hyper-real. Whereas trust is objective in its connection to symbolic representations, faith is a subjective connection to those representations. Frenzy is the meta-real version of disconnection. When in a state of frenzy, a person makes associations between symbols, but does so in a way that is disorienting rather than establishing a unity. In the bottom right is catharsis, the meta-real version of release. Catharsis is similar to serenity, but comes from an easing of symbolic tension. Catharsis happens when symbolic representations are negentropically contracted into a satisfactory subjective state. Lastly, there is fate. Fate is not conventionally considered an emotion, but is the best word to describe this portion of the system. Fate is a tension between reality and the symbolic meta-narrative of a person's life story. Fate is neither about the future nor the past, but the synchronic intersection of the two. In the middle of the meta-real wheel is vacuity. Meta-real emotions are distinctly mental in their role as association generators, and vacuity is a state of neutral empty-mindedness that limits the power of the mind to generate symbolic associations. The normative meta-real emotions are obsession and discrimination, with embrace as a transform point. Obsession can be seen as the counterpart to addiction, where the latter is a linear fixation on symbols and the former is an embrace of symbols. Discrimination is a negative form of association where connections are denied rather than embraced. This discussion covers the entirety of the structure, both primary and secondary registers, but this is only the synchronic structure of emotions. Emotions can be synchronic as a current state of consciousness, or can be projected onto time diachronically. Emotions can be directed towards the future through futuricity, or can be directed towards the past through historicity. While conceptually, diachronic emotion wheels could be constructed for every register of the graph, there are not enough words in the English language to accomplish this without extensive use of neologism, so a single diagram for the past and future will have to suffice. Expansion in the forward direction becomes hope, and in the past direction becomes gratitude. Hope is happiness in something that has yet to be actualized, happiness in possibility. Gratitude, on the other hand, is happiness in something that has already occurred, happiness in actuality. Contraction towards the future is called submission. Submission occurs when a sadness is caused by an unfavorable prediction of the future. In the opposite direction is mourning, which is a sadness in events of the past. One can mourn for a loss, or mourn more broadly towards anything that causes sadness. Negentropy with futuricity is purpose, and with historicity is satisfaction. As a feeling of order, pride and harmony become purpose when directed towards a goal. Satisfaction, in contrast, is a pride and harmony partaking in a goal already accomplished. Future-oriented entropy becomes condemnation, which is a shame caused by the apprehension of being doomed. Past-oriented entropy becomes regret, which is shame in a past action. Connection in the future is called anticipation, and in the past is called nostalgia. Anticipation is caused by associations made towards the future that cause the tonal affect of connection, a sense of comfort or peace. Nostalgia carries the same tonal quality, but is caused by remembrance of events or phenomena of the past. The futuricity of disconnection is dread, which is fear of something yet to happen. Conversely, haunting is the lingering fear or trauma of a past action that cannot be shaken from memory. The future version of release is relief. Relief is a sense of ease or relaxation caused by knowing that the future is free from dangers or tensions. Conversely, the past version, contentedness, is a relaxation caused by knowing that the past is secure and relieved of tension. Lastly, there is excitement and rumination as the future and past versions of tension. Excitement is like drive and motivation, but is provoked by the possibility of action in the future. Rumination is attention and contemplating past actions. The neutral position of the futuricity wheel is latency. This is a lack of emotional manifestation that is only a mere possibility in the future. the neutral position of historicity is vestige, a trace of emotions from the past that have disappeared into a state of neutrality. There are also future and past versions of the normative emotions. Futuricity is transformed by projection, and historicity is transformed by reflection. In the future, desire becomes aspiration. One aspires towards a desire for an object or phenomenon of the future. In the past, desire becomes reverence, which is a positive judgment of something from history. On the negative side, antipathy towards a future phenomenon is resentment. Resentment is aimed at the future because it is projected onto something unfulfilled. Antipathy towards a past phenomenon is disdain. Disdain is a reflection on something in the past judged to be bad. That covers the entirety of how emotions fit onto the system as a whole. It is possible for there to be more emotions than what has been covered, but every emotion does fit onto the graph through description and combination. The labels are intended to be viewed descriptively rather than prescriptively. This means that instead of considering the prescriptive dictionary definition of an emotional word and trying to contort it to the graph, you should think descriptively about what the structure of the graph implies about the word through its system of relations. Some emotional words are synonyms closely related to the labels on the graph, while others are constructed through a combination of emotions on the graph. Going through all of the emotions of the system, you may have already picked up on a unique feature of the graph, which is that the structure of the registers and the wheel of relation parallel each other. This is intentional. The wheel of relation can be superimposed upon the registers to see how relations and registers correspond to each other. It can be seen how expansion is symbolic and contraction is abstract. Symbolism is the process by which a cognitive model of the world expands into greater possibilities. Symbols, because they are not what they represent, add information to the world and expand meaning beyond the liminal. Abstraction, on the other hand, reduces meaning by abstaining from symbolism in favor of raw information. In the abstract, the world has not yet been expanded into universals. It is also clear how negentropy and entropy parallel the iconic and formal registers. Formality, being material in focus, is entropic like the physical world. Formality requires constant reinforcement to reconstruct the natural degradation of complexity. This is opposed to the more subjective iconic register, which is where ideas live as an ideal ordering of the world. Iconic representations are simplified versions of the physical world, more easily understood by the mind through their negentropy. Connection is meta-real. Connections are mental associations that construct a meta-reality that imbues a cognitive model of the world with mythos. This is contrasted by disconnection in the subreal register. Subreality is about raw, abstract information that disorients a person from a reality that makes sense. In the subreal, there are no universals, and instead there is only particularity. Release parallels the ideal, attention parallels the hyperreal. Idealism carries abstract information, but unlike the dissociation of the subreal, ideal information conforms to the structure of mind. The Platonic forms of shape and number belong here. Hyperreality signifies tension because it involves the fixation upon entropic, expansionary symbols. Hyperreal symbols are restricted to codified, linear terms that do not allow room for interpretation or connection. In these ways, the relationships between relational states and mental registers can greaten our understanding of a given emotion from the system. For example, delight can be considered expansionary expansion, whereas pity can be considered expansionary contraction. Awe can be considered connective negentropy, whereas hubris can be considered tense negentropy, and so on. This system, as a tool, provides a comprehensive view of the varieties of emotional expressions. It accomplishes this through neutral, phenomenological, and structural principles that provide exceptional clarity. The clarity of the system helps to disambiguate emotions and show their place in a system of relations. By separating aesthetic and normative emotions and contextualizing them with transformation, the roles of perception and judgment are distinct yet integrated. Aesthetic emotions shape tonal perception, while normative emotions shape affective judgment. This disentangles aspects of affective phenomena, which is a problem with how emotions are presented by common language and culture. The aesthetic emotions are neither good nor bad, even happiness and sadness. These emotions present affective tones, but are not judgments of an object. In Western culture, happiness is tyrannical. Popular culture imposes normativity onto the polarity of happiness and sadness and largely ignores the other emotions. Happiness is considered by many to be the goal of life itself. The term eudaimonia in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is often translated to happiness, but this misses the important difference in technical use between the terms. For Aristotle, desire is aimed at a good, and a good can either be instrumental or intrinsic. Extrinsic goods are objects of desire like wealth, whereas intrinsic goods are desired for their own sake, like pleasure. On the graph, instrumental goods are placed on the left side, and intrinsic goods are placed on the right side. This also parallels the concept of extrinsic desire and intrinsic desire. This positioning highlights how happiness is not purely intrinsic, but lies in between instrumental and intrinsic. A more accurate translation of eudaimonia is negentropy, or harmony. Negentropy, as an emotion, is a coherent ordering of elements into a harmonious whole. Aristotle views the purpose of life not to be pleasure, as is exemplified by the tone of happiness, but a flourishing of all of life's elements. Western culture lacked words to describe this nuanced approach to life, which is why this graph is so valuable. Nietzsche also helps us to resist the tyranny of happiness. Early in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's mouthpiece, Zarathustra, exclaims, "What good is my happiness? It is poverty and dirt and miserable ease. But my happiness should justify existence itself." Followed by, "It is not your sin, but your moderation that cries to heaven." The happiness imposed upon people by Western culture is one of sustained moderation. Unlike eudaimonia or negentropy, pleasure cannot last. Because of this, tyrannical happiness is enforced moderation. Christianity, as it is practiced in modern society, holds a deep contradiction between its orientation towards happiness and its aesthetic prohibitions. The happiness Nietzsche proposes is a far more radical happiness of aesthetic pleasure rather than normative moderation. Nietzsche says that aesthetics justify existence, but the happiness of Christianity can justify nothing but banality or miserable ease. The other aesthetic emotions should also not be restricted to normative projection. Sadness, fear, shame, and anger are aesthetic tones that serve a valuable role in shaping perception and affective awareness. Tragic films help us to come to terms with contraction. Metal music helps us to express tension, and shame allows for pleasure to be found in naughtiness. Modern Western culture, because of its restrictive normativity, disallows the full breadth of emotional expressions to be achieved. Suppressing emotions dampens the aesthetic quality of life. Emotions, as fundamentally abstract modes of consciousness, have no standard for correctness. It is not incorrect to fear anger at someone trying to be nice to you, and it is not incorrect to feel fear at something that poses no danger. Emotions are monadic relations that arise to inform a person about the tone of a phenomenon. The idea of emotional correctness is an unfortunate byproduct of conventional philosophy's emphasis on intentionality. But as discussed here, emotions arise pre-intentionally. You would not call a peach wrong for being blue. You would accept the tone of the object as it is stimulated in the mind. Emotions start in the primordial order, and it is called an order for a reason. The unconscious mind is not random. It is intelligent in its own right, and the abstract reasoning of the abstract registers should be taken seriously as a tool for deeper understanding than what is provided by the formality so dominant in Western culture. It is also noteworthy how love is positioned in the formal register. This is a reflection of Western culture, not a reflection of its more broad and romanticized form. In the West, love is treated like a checkbox. You love someone or you do not love someone. A formal confession or exclamation of love is a milestone in a relationship, and the formality of love is reinforced by the social conditioning of repeating the word love in greetings and farewells. There is a sense in which love is a contractual, logistical commandment of the social order. Despite its restrictive formality, this version of love has more communicative value than romanticized, reified love. Love is used so broadly that it loses its meaning, however, and can be modeled through a combinative position on the structure. Romanticized love, in its broadness, should involve not just formally loving something or someone, but also desiring it abstractly, having interest in it iconically, and appreciating it symbolically. Romanticized love should also not be limited to normative emotions, and should involve aesthetic pleasures and pains comprising the whole wheel of relation. A heightened sense of aesthetic empathy can attach a person to an object of love, experienced as reciprocation and understanding of all of the modes of emotion. Depression is not used as a label for any of the emotions in the system. Depression is often miscategorized by people who have not experienced it as a form of sadness, but this is inaccurate. Depression is a stillness and a lack of affect. In a depressed state, a person struggles to experience emotions at all, including sadness. This is why depression can be understood as a lasting stillness in all registers. Western culture, with its emphasis on formal happiness, prescribes things that bring happiness to depressed people, but the stillness of depression may be experienced in any or all of the registers. Formal happiness may not be the right medicine for someone lacking affect in the iconic register, for example. Emotions of all kinds inform intelligence. The rhetorical appeals of ethos, logos, pathos, and the lesser-known kairos map onto the diamond version of the graph. On the left side of the formal register belongs logos, which is formally objective in its appeal to logic and reasoning. On the opposite side, in the iconic register, belongs pathos. Pathos is subjective in form and represents experiential emotions. The symbolic register at the top corresponds to ethos, which uses authority and identity as symbols. Kairos refers to contingency and timing, making it abstract. With this arrangement, it can be seen how the system provides a more comprehensive view of how emotions relate to intelligence than conventional models. All of the rhetorical appeals are emotional, not just pathos. Many people in Western culture strive for happiness, but only understand the term formally. It is logical to want to be happy, whereas it is pathetic to want to be joyous. The graph is intentionally symmetrical, which provides a balanced structure that fills in gaps left by language. The words pathetic and pathological, derived from pathos, in modern English carry strictly negative connotations and mean to be weak, stupid, or hysterical due to emotions. The more neutral, archaic definition of pathetic is pertaining to emotions, which is far more useful. Language deeply informs how we view the world, and the biases of language reflect the biases of culture. There is no symmetrical word to pathological, such as logological, meaning to be overly logical to the point of detriment. Alternatively, a word like logetic could mirror pathetic, meaning to be weak due to logic. The symmetry of the graph allows one to comprehend emotions structurally rather than prescriptively through language. Some of the emotional labels are not conventional or common emotional words in English, but nonetheless can be experienced because of how they manifest through the mental registers. This system demonstrates how emotions inform reasoning at all levels. The term emotional intelligence is the vague social construct without clear definition. Emotional intelligence is often considered to be the ability to identify emotions in the self and in others, but this is flawed. Conventional intelligence is not about knowing the truth value of propositions. Intelligence, instead, involves relational reasoning. It is about the ability to recognize and extrapolate upon patterns in space, time, and language. A person can have a high intelligence through relational reasoning, but be ignorant of facts or truth values. In the same way, emotional intelligence should not be considered the ability to recognize the truth value of an emotion. Identifying emotions is mostly a linguistic trick, not a deep relational awareness. It is particularly problematic to consider emotional intelligence to be the ability to recognize emotions in others. Emotions, as subjective sensations, are strictly private phenomena. All one has to go off of in recognizing emotions in others is behaviors, which are not emotions in themselves. Contemporary affective science has shown how behaviors like facial expressions are a poor indicator of a person's emotional state, despite what the basic emotion and universal emotion theorists would like to argue. Facial expressions like smiling when happy or frowning when sad are simply stereotypes that do not actually reflect the way emotional behaviors act in the real world. In primates like chimpanzees, a smile is displayed to indicate fear or submission. This can also be seen in humans, such as in the case of nervous reflexes. If emotional intelligence is to mean anything at all, it must be understood relationally. An emotionally intelligent person comprehends how emotions interact with the primordial, social, and symbolic order. These orders present patterns of emotional content and form that interact dynamically with cognition. Emotional intelligence involves understanding how emotions structurally transform and interact to create aesthetic and normative awareness. There is intelligence in not just identifying emotions, but interpreting them through primordial awareness, social dynamics, and symbolic representation. Emotional intelligence should also not be confused with empathy and sympathy. Empathy is the ability to understand someone else's emotional state, and sympathy is the ability to mimic someone else's emotional state. These are dispositional tendencies, not intelligences. Emotions should also not be viewed morally. Because there is no standard for correctness in emotions, there is no emotion one ought to have. As tonal sensations, emotions simply are. Emotions are an is, not an ought. Unlike most emotional theories, which are reductive, simplified, and moralized, this system is structurally sound and rooted in philosophical theory. It combines elements of structuralism, psychoanalysis, phenomenology, and relational ontology to create a comprehensive yet intuitive overall system. Through the primary registers of abstract, formal, iconic, and symbolic, and through the secondary registers of subreal, ideal, hyperreal, and metareal, it integrates emotions into a mental acquisition process of meaning. The wheel of relation provides the structure of aesthetic emotions, which are distinguished from normative emotions. As a tool, the system provides a way to understand emotions and their complex interactions as a process of relationality. If you have any suggestions for improvement, or think any emotions should have a different label, feel free to discuss in the comments. A formal paper version of this essay is available as a PDF on my Patreon, linked in the description below. This has been Ryan9. Thank you for watching.